The doors were marked as exits, but they had been locked from the outside. The curtain was advertised as fireproof, but it was never truly tested. And the crowd that filled every seat, aisle, and every inch of standing room that afternoon believed that they were safe. It was the day before New Year's Eve, when a packed matinee audience settled into their seats at Chicago's newest, most dazzling theater to watch a light-hearted holiday comedy. Mostly women and children, families on their winter break, drawn downtown by newspaper advertisements boasting that this theater, unlike any before it, was absolutely fireproof. Within minutes, that promise would collapse into smoke, panic, and silence. By the time the flames were finally out, 602 people were dead, making it to this day the deadliest single-building fire in American history. Not a war, not a natural disaster, a theater. A place built for laughter, for music, for an afternoon's escape, became a tomb for hundreds of people, killed not by fire alone, but by every safety measure the owners had quietly chosen to skip. This is the story of the Iroquois Theater, a story of ambition without patience, of beauty built on a foundation of lies, and of 600 people who trusted a building that was never as safe as it claimed to be. Chapter 1. A city hungry for spectacle. To understand how the Iroquois Theater came to exist, and how it came to fall, we have to step back into the city that built it. By the turn of the 20th century, Chicago was a city obsessed with proving itself. Just over 3 decades earlier, in 1871, the Great Chicago Fire had reduced much of the city to ash, destroying thousands of buildings and leaving countless families homeless in a single night. Rather than break the city's spirit, that disaster seemed to feed it. Chicago rebuilt itself taller, grander, and faster than almost any city in the world, determined to prove that fire could never again define it. Skyscrapers rose along the loop. Railroads connected it to every corner of the country. And with that growth came money, ambition, and an enormous appetite for entertainment. Theater in this era was not the quiet, respectable pastime it is often remembered as today. It was a spectacle. Vaudeville houses, musical comedies, and lavish stage productions were sweeping across America, and Chicago wanted to be at the center of that wave. Audiences packed into ornate playhouses to see comedians, dancers, and singers perform beneath painted backdrops, gaslight, and increasingly, the new marvel of electric arc lighting. Owning a great theater in this era meant something. It was a symbol of a city's sophistication, its wealth, and its place among the great cultural capitals of the world. Chicago, still shadowed by memories of the fire that nearly erased it, wanted a theater unlike anything the country had ever seen. Something that would draw comparisons not to New York, but to the opera houses of Europe. But beneath the excitement, there was a darker undercurrent that few in the audience ever thought about. Theater fires were not a rare or distant danger. They were one of the most persistent nightmares of the entertainment industry. Wooden stages, hanging curtains made of flammable fabric, open gas and arc lighting, and audiences packed into tight rows of seating created the perfect conditions for catastrophe. And catastrophe had already struck before. In December of 1876, the Brooklyn Theater in New York caught fire during a performance, killing close to 300 people, many of whom had been seated in the cheaper upper galleries with limited ways to escape. It remained a grim warning etched into the memory of American theater owners, architects, and city officials alike. And yet, as the years passed, that warning began to fade. No major theater disaster had struck America in nearly 3 decades, and with that silence came something dangerous: complacency. Safety precautions that once seemed urgent began to feel like unnecessary expenses. Fire drills were skipped. Inspections became routine formalities rather than serious examinations. Architects and builders often treated fireproofing as a selling point rather than a genuine standard to be tested and enforced. Into this atmosphere of ambition, wealth, and quiet forgetfulness, Chicago's business elite set out to build something extraordinary. They wanted a theater that would embody everything the city had become: modern, magnificent, and untouchable by the very disaster their predecessors had once feared most. They believed they could build a building that fire could never conquer. They were wrong, and the price of that mistake would be paid not by the men who built it, but by the people who trusted it. Chapter 2: The Race to Build a Fireproof Dream. The men behind the Iroquois Theater were not dreamers that are chasing beauty for beauty's sake. They were businessmen, part of a powerful theatrical syndicate that understood something simple and profitable. Chicago's Loop was full of shoppers, travelers, and wealthy families with nowhere elegant to spend an afternoon. They wanted to build a theater in the very heart of downtown, close enough to the shopping district that women visiting the city could step out of a department store and into a matinee without ever needing an escort or worrying about safety on the street. It was a calculated business decision wrapped in the language of luxury, and it needed to be built quickly, beautifully, and impressively enough to overshadow every other stage in the city. To design it, they turned to a young architect named Benjamin Marshall, a man with talent and ambition far beyond his years, but with a career that was still being built one project at a time. Marshall was given an enormous task. He was expected to design not just a theater, but a landmark, a building so grand it would rival the opera houses of Europe, and so safe that no one would ever think twice about the danger of fire inside its walls. He reportedly studied the histories of past theater disasters carefully, determined that his building would never be remembered the way the Brooklyn Theater had been. Yet ambition and study are not the same as time, and time was the one thing this project never had enough of. From the beginning, the construction of the Iroquois Theater was plagued by delays. Labor disputes slowed the work, as unions and contractors clashed over wages and hours. Material shortages held up construction schedules that had already been drawn too tightly. And according to several accounts from the period, Marshall himself struggled to complete his architectural drawings on time. Every delay pushed the opening date closer to the profitable holiday season, and every delay increased the pressure from the syndicate's investors, who had sunk enormous sums of money into a building they needed operating and earning as quickly as possible. This is where the seeds of disaster were quietly planted. In the race to open before the winter season, corners that should never have been cut were cut anyway. Fire escapes were left incomplete. Exit doors were installed without the panic bar hardware that would later become standard. Doors that opened inward instead of outward, doors that could be locked from the outside to prevent people from sneaking in without paying. The ventilation system above the stage was left unfinished. None of these omissions were secrets. They were choices made under pressure by men who believed the odds of disaster were worth the risk of a faster opening. And yet publicly, the theater was marketed as something entirely different. Advertisements and newspaper coverage boasted that the Iroquois was absolutely fireproof. It was a phrase repeated so often that it became less a claim than an assumption in the mind of the Chicago public. Parents brought their children without a second thought. Teachers organized school outings around it. Women traveled into the city specifically because they had been told, again and again, that this theater was different, that this theater was safe in a way no other building had ever been. The truth was far more complicated. The building itself, its steel frame, its stone and plaster construction, was indeed built to resist the spread of fire far better than the wooden theaters of decades past. In that narrow, technical sense, it was true, the structure would not burn down easily. But a building that resists fire is not the same as a building that protects the people inside it during one. The Iroquois had been built to survive a fire. It had not been built to let its audience survive one. On the 23rd of November, in the year 1903, after months of delay, labor conflict, and rushed compromises, the doors of the Iroquois Theater finally opened to the public. To the thousands who walked through its grand entrance that night, it looked like nothing short of a miracle, a palace of marble, gold, and light, promising elegance, comfort, and above all, safety. None of them could have known that the very safety they had been promised existed only on paper, and that in just 5 short weeks, the illusion would collapse as violently and suddenly as the fire that would one day tear through its stage. Chapter 3: A Palace Unveiled. The doors of the Iroquois Theater opened for the very first time, and Chicago responded exactly the way the syndicate had hoped it would. Crowds gathered along Randolph Street, craning their necks upward at a facade unlike anything the city had seen before. The building rose in pale terracotta and stone, its entrance framed by columns and ornamental detail meant to evoke the grand theaters and opera houses of old Europe. Above the doors, electric lights traced the outline of the building, glowing against the winter darkness, a modern marvel announcing itself to a city that prided itself on modern marvels. For a city still carrying the memory of its own destruction by fire, the Iroquois seemed to represent something almost triumphant. Proof that Chicago could build bigger, safer, and more beautiful than ever before. Inside, the theater was even more breathtaking than its exterior promised. Guests stepped into a soaring entrance foyer with a ceiling that stretched roughly 60 feet above their heads, an almost cathedral-like space meant to overwhelm the senses before the performance had even begun. Grand staircases curved upward on either side, carpeted in rich color and lined with polished brass railings, leading patrons up toward the balcony and gallery levels. The walls were finished in marble and gilded plasterwork, catching and reflecting the glow of electric chandeliers, a lighting technology still new and exciting enough to be a spectacle in itself. Velvet, mahogany, and gold seemed to be everywhere the eye landed, and for the ordinary Chicago family stepping into a space like this for the very first time, it must have felt less like attending a play and more like walking into a palace built for royalty. The auditorium itself was designed to hold approximately 1,602 seated patrons, spread across 3 distinct levels: the main floor, known as the orchestra or parquet section, along with a first balcony and an upper gallery above it. Every detail seemed engineered to project luxury and permanence. The proscenium arch framing the stage was massive and ornately decorated, and the seating, upholstery, and finishes throughout the building were, by every account of the time, some of the finest ever installed in an American theater. Critics who attended those early performances were nearly unanimous in their praise. One prominent theatrical writer of the era went so far as to declare that the Iroquois was the most beautiful theater in Chicago, and that few theaters anywhere in America could rival its architectural perfection. It was by every visible measure an instant triumph. But grandeur has a way of disguising what it does not want examined. Behind the marble finishes and gilded ceilings, the systems meant to protect the very people admiring them. The fire escapes, the exit doors, the ventilation shafts above the stage remained quietly, invisibly incomplete. No usher pointed this out. No newspaper critic thought to ask about it. The public had been told that this building was different from every theater that came before it, that it was fireproof in a way no other structure in America could claim to be, and so no one thought to look past the beauty for the substance underneath it. For 5 weeks, the Iroquois operated exactly as its owners had hoped. Audiences filled its seats to watch the popular musical comedy Mr. Bluebeard, marveling at the same marble halls and gilded ceilings that had captivated the city on opening night. Word spread of the theater's elegance, and families across Chicago began planning visits of their own, especially with the holiday season approaching. No one walking through those doors that winter had any reason to suspect that the palace they so admired had been built on a foundation of unfinished promises. And in just a matter of weeks, those promises would be tested in the worst possible way. Chapter 4: The Promises They Didn't Keep. Beneath the marble and gold of the Iroquois theater lay a long list of quiet failures. To understand what happened on the day of the fire, it helps to understand exactly what was missing, because almost nothing about that afternoon's tragedy was the result of bad luck. Nearly every fatal factor had already been built into the building itself, long before a single flame appeared. The Iroquois had been designed with more exits than almost any theater in the country, more than 30 in total, a detail the owners were proud to advertise as proof of their commitment to safety. But having exits and having usable exits are two very different things. Many of those doors were never marked or lit in any visible way. There were no illuminated exit signs glowing above them, no ushers stationed to direct panicked crowds toward them, nothing to indicate in the dim, ordinary lighting of the auditorium that safety lay just beyond an unremarkable wall. The theater's owners had decided that clearly marked exits would be distracting, a visual interruption to the elegant atmosphere they had worked so hard to create. Beauty had quietly been placed ahead of survival. Even worse, many of the doors that did exist were locked. Some were secured with heavy deadbolts, installed specifically to prevent people without tickets from slipping in through side entrances during a performance and watching for free. It was a policy meant to protect profits, not people. And in the chaos of an emergency, those same locks would turn potential escape routes into dead ends. Then there were the fire escapes themselves, the metal stairways bolted to the theater's exterior, meant to carry balcony and gallery patrons safely down to the street below. In the rush to open before the holiday season, several of these escapes had been left incomplete. Some lacked proper railings, others ended abruptly, without stairs connecting them fully to the ground, forcing anyone who reached them to face a dangerous drop rather than a safe descent. Above the stage itself, the theater's ventilation system, one of its most heavily advertised safety features, remained unfinished as well. In theory, this system was designed to draw smoke, heat, and flame upward and outward through vents in the roof, protecting the audience below by redirecting the worst of a fire away from the seating areas. In practice, key components of that system had never been properly installed or connected. When fire did eventually break out, it would have nowhere efficient to escape upward, and so it would billow outward instead, directly toward the crowd. Just as troubling was the theater's so-called fireproof curtain, a massive safety curtain meant to drop between the stage and the audience the moment any fire broke out backstage, sealing off the flames before they could spread into the seating areas. It was advertised as asbestos, a material known at the time for its fire-resistant properties, and its presence had been used repeatedly to reassure the public of the building's safety. In reality, the material used contained only a limited amount of true asbestos, mixed with far more flammable fibers, and the mechanism designed to lower it smoothly into place had never been properly tested under real conditions. And then there was the matter of communication with the outside world. Astonishingly, the Iroquois had no fire alarm box connected directly to the city's fire department, and no telephone line dedicated to summoning help in an emergency. If a fire broke out, the responsibility of alerting the fire department fell entirely on whoever happened to notice it first, running out into the street to find help, rather than any built-in system designed to call for it immediately. Finally, there was the matter of the crowd itself. On the day that mattered most, the theater would be filled far beyond a comfortable capacity, with hundreds of standing room patrons packed into the aisles at the back of the auditorium, blocking the very walkways that seated patrons would need in order to reach the exits at all. Individually, each of these failures might have been survivable. Together, they formed an almost perfect blueprint for catastrophe, one that required only a single spark in the wrong place, at the wrong moment, to bring the entire illusion of safety crashing down around the very people who had trusted it most. Chapter 5. A full house for the holidays. By the last week of December in 1903, the Iroquois Theater had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Mr. Bluebeard, the musical comedy that had opened the theater 5 weeks earlier, was still playing to audiences night after night, its light-hearted songs and slapstick humor drawing families looking for an easy afternoon of entertainment during the holiday break. Chicago school children were out of classes for the season, and with them came a surge of matinee attendance, mothers bringing sons and daughters downtown for a treat before the new year arrived. Business at the box office had been somewhat inconsistent in the weeks prior, hampered by poor weather and ongoing labor unrest across the city, but that was about to change dramatically. Wednesday, the 30th of December, fell in that quiet stretch of days between Christmas and New Year's Eve, a time when families had little else planned and children were eager to be taken somewhere exciting. The matinee performance of Mr. Bluebeard that afternoon drew easily the largest crowd the theater had seen since its opening night. Every single seat in the house had been sold, and beyond that, theater staff had continued selling standing room tickets well past the point of comfortable capacity, packing hundreds more people into the space at the rear of the orchestra level and along the back of the balcony and gallery sections. Estimates from that day placed the total number of people inside the theater somewhere between 1,900 and 2,200, filling a building designed to comfortably seat 1,602. The overwhelming majority of that audience were women and children. Mothers filled entire rows with sons and daughters bundled in winter coats. Teachers had brought groups of school children as an end-of-break outing, and the mood inside the theater that afternoon was one of warmth, laughter, and easy holiday cheer. Ushers moved through packed aisles trying to seat latecomers wherever space could be found, and by the time the lights dimmed and the orchestra began to play, people were standing shoulder to shoulder at the back of every level, some even seated directly in the aisles themselves, blocking pathways that led toward the theater's exits. None of this seemed unusual or alarming to the people inside. Overcrowded matinees were common practice across American theaters at the time, and the extra ticket sales were a welcome sign of the production's success. Parents settled in with their children on their laps. Friends leaned close to whisper jokes about the performance. Somewhere in the orchestra section, the smell of coats and perfume mixed with the faint scent of machine oil drifting up from the stage below. The show moved through its first act without incident, drawing laughter and applause exactly as it had for the past 5 weeks. The curtain rose on the second act. The orchestra tuned their instruments for an upcoming musical number. Backstage, performers adjusted costumes and waited for their cues beneath the glow of electric spotlights rigged high above the stage. Out in the audience, children fidgeted in their seats, waiting eagerly for the next song to begin. It was an ordinary winter afternoon in Chicago, filled with an audience that trusted the walls around them completely. Within minutes, that trust would be shattered in ways none of them could have imagined. Chapter 6. The Spark Behind the Curtain. It was approximately 3:15 in the afternoon when the second act of Mr. Bluebeard reached one of its most elaborate musical numbers, a romantic duet performed beneath dim, blue-tinted stage lighting meant to suggest moonlight. 16 performers moved through a choreographed routine while the orchestra played softly beneath them. The entire stage bathed in that soft, artificial glow so popular in productions of the era. High above the stage, mounted on a narrow platform to one side, an arc light glowed with the electric current needed to cast that pale blue wash across the performers below. It was ordinary equipment for a production of this scale. On this particular afternoon, however, the electricians running that light were carrying far more electrical current through its wiring than the equipment was designed to handle safely. Without warning, the arc light sputtered, sparked, and blew out its fuse. A thin trail of sparks drifted downward from the fixture, landing against a length of muslin curtain hanging nearby. One of the many painted fabric backdrops used to create the illusion of scenery throughout the production. Muslin, a lightweight cotton fabric, was cheap, easy to paint, and used constantly in theatrical productions of the time, but it was also remarkably flammable. Within seconds of contact, a small flame began climbing up the fabric, quiet and almost unnoticed at first, against the dim blue lighting of the number still playing out below. A stagehand positioned near the curtain noticed the flame almost immediately and attempted to beat it out by hand, but the fire had already begun spreading faster than he could contain it. Another crew member grabbed a long pole equipped with a device meant to douse small fires exactly like this one, but by the time he reached the flames, they had grown beyond what the tool could handle. The fire moved upward along the curtain and toward the network of ropes, backdrops, and additional muslin scenery hanging above the stage, each new piece of fabric offering more fuel for flames that were now climbing rapidly toward the theater's unfinished ventilation system above. On stage, the performers continued for a few moments longer, uncertain at first whether what they were witnessing was part of the production or a genuine emergency unfolding directly above their heads. Small pieces of burning debris began drifting down from the rigging, and the realization spread quickly among the cast that this was no special effect. Panic broke out backstage as performers scattered toward the wings, desperate to put distance between themselves and the rapidly spreading flames now consuming the scenery above the stage. Recognizing the severity of what was happening, stage crew members rushed toward the mechanism controlling the theater's safety curtain, the massive fire-resistant barrier meant to drop into place precisely in a moment like this one, sealing off the burning stage from the audience seated just beyond it. The curtain began its descent as designed, lowering steadily downward toward the stage floor. Then, roughly 2/3 of the way down, it stopped. Whether it caught on a piece of rigging equipment hanging loose from the ceiling or jammed within its own track due to incomplete installation, accounts from that day differ slightly on the exact cause. What remains certain is that the curtain never reached the stage floor. It hung there, buckled and useless, leaving a wide gap between the burning stage and the packed auditorium beyond it. The single safety feature the owners had promised would contain a fire exactly like this one, failing at the precise moment it was needed most. Chapter 7. The Clown Who Stayed. Backstage, in the midst of the growing chaos, one performer was preparing for an upcoming specialty number, his costume still incomplete. His name was Eddie Foy, a well-known comedian who had built his career on physical comedy, and had been headlining the production in the role of Sister Anne. When the panic broke out around him, his first thought was not of the stage or the audience, but of his own son, Brian, who had come along with him to the theater that afternoon, and was standing nearby, watching the commotion unfold with growing fear. Foy found the boy quickly, gathered him into his arms, and pushed through the scattering crew members toward the rear of the building. Reaching a stagehand near one of the backstage exits, Foy thrust his son into the man's arms and shouted for him to get the boy outside to safety. For most people in that position, that act alone would have been enough, a father saving his child before fleeing the burning building himself. But as Foy turned to watch his son disappear toward the rear doors, another thought took hold of him. One he would later describe as impossible to ignore. Beyond the stage, on the other side of that stuck and useless safety curtain, sat nearly 2,000 people who had no idea yet that anything was wrong. If panic broke out among that many people crammed into narrow aisles and blocked exits, the results would be catastrophic. Rather than continuing his own escape, Foy turned back toward the stage. He walked out in front of the audience exactly as he was, still dressed in his costume, tights, an exaggerated smock-like shirt, comic shoes, and a wig with a ridiculous curled pigtail rising from the back of his head, an appearance built for laughter, now standing in front of a crowd about to face the worst moment of their lives. Behind him, flaming debris had already begun falling from the rigging above, and the members of the octet who had been performing moments earlier were still frozen in their positions on stage, some of them visibly trembling as the fire spread closer overhead. Foy raised his hands and called out to the audience, urging them not to panic, insisting that there was no reason to rush, that everything could still be handled calmly if people simply moved toward the exits in an orderly way. He turned toward the orchestra conductor, a man named Herbert Dillia, and shouted for him to keep playing, to start any piece of music at all, anything to hold the audience's attention and keep the mood from tipping into chaos. The conductor lifted his baton, and the orchestra began playing again, their music rising up even as smoke thickened above the stage and the temperature in the building began climbing rapidly. For a short while, it seemed to work. Members of the orchestra continued playing even as some around them quietly slipped away from their seats, unable to ignore the flames now visible above the stage. Foy remained at the front of that stage the entire time, alternating between calming words to the crowd and urgent instructions to the musicians below him, refusing to leave his position even as the danger around him grew more severe by the second. Eventually, only Foy and the conductor remained, the rest of the musicians having fled toward the safety of the building's rear exits. Foy glanced upward one final time and saw the scenery above him fully engulfed in flame, burning debris falling dangerously close around his feet. Only then did he finally turn and run toward the same exit his son had used moments earlier. Escaping the stage just seconds before, the entire structure above it collapsed into the growing inferno. His courage that afternoon would later be remembered as one of the only acts of genuine order in a disaster, otherwise defined by chaos, panic, and fatal, irreversible mistakes. Chapter 8. The Doors That Wouldn't Open. While Eddie Foy stood on stage pleading for calm, the illusion of order he was fighting so hard to maintain had already begun to collapse throughout the rest of the theater. Smoke had started pouring through the gap where the safety curtain hung stuck, rolling out over the orchestra section and rising up toward the balcony and gallery levels above. Within moments, the same flaming debris that had been falling backstage began drifting out over the front rows of the audience, and the calm that Foy and the orchestra had worked so hard to preserve broke apart entirely. People rose from their seats all at once, and what began as scattered movement toward the aisles quickly became a single, desperate crush of bodies pushing in every direction at once. The trouble started almost immediately at the theater's main exits. Patrons fleeing toward the doors they had entered through hours earlier found some of them jammed shut, held closed by an unfamiliar style of door bolt that few in the panicked crowd knew how to operate, hardware that would later be blamed for costing precious seconds during the worst moments of the disaster. Other doors throughout the building remained sealed entirely, offering no way out at all to the people pressed desperately against them. Because none of the exits had been clearly marked or lit, many people didn't even know where to look for a way out in the first place, wasting critical time searching blindly through smoke-filled hallways for doors they had never been shown. The greatest tragedy unfolded in the theater's upper levels, the balcony and gallery sections where hundreds of standing room patrons had been packed in against the back walls before the performance even began. As panic spread through these upper sections, crowds surged toward the narrow staircases leading down to the main floor, the only route many believed could lead them to safety. But those staircases had never been designed to handle a crowd moving with this kind of speed and desperation all at once. People stumbled, while others fell, and within moments, the stairwells became blocked by people itself, unable to move forward or back, as more and more people poured down from above. It was here that the disaster claimed its most devastating toll, hundreds of victims lost not to flame itself, but to the crushing weight and suffocating density of the crowd, trying desperately to escape it. In the gallery level, some patrons who had reached the exterior fire escapes discovered that the metal stairways meant to carry them safely down to the alley below simply ended in mid-air, incomplete structures left unfinished in the rush to open the theater before the holiday season. With flames and smoke closing in behind them, and nowhere left to climb down safely, a number of those trapped on the fire escapes made the desperate decision to jump rather than remain and be consumed by the fire spreading rapidly through the building behind them. Below, in the narrow alley running along the theater's northern side, a growing number of bodies began to gather on the pavement, a space that would be remembered afterward by a name that captured exactly what had happened there: Death's Alley. Throughout the auditorium, the fire itself was not the primary killer that afternoon. Far more people lost their lives to smoke inhalation and the crushing effects of the panicked crowd than to flame itself. Victims overtaken while still seated, or collapsed in aisles and stairwells, unable to reach any of the exits in time. Because the theater had no fire alarm box and no direct telephone connection to the city's fire department. The first calls for help came not from any internal warning system, but from bystanders on the street outside, who noticed smoke pouring from the building and ran to alert authorities themselves. Precious minutes had already passed before firefighters even began making their way toward the scene. By the time emergency crews arrived and began working their way into the building, the worst of the disaster had already unfolded within the span of just a few catastrophic minutes. What they found inside would haunt the city of Chicago for generations to come, rows upon rows of victims who had simply been unable to escape a building that had promised nothing like this could ever happen within its walls. Chapter 9: A City in Mourning. By the time firefighters and police made their way into the wreckage of the Iroquois theater, the scale of what had happened inside was almost impossible to comprehend. Rows of seats that had been filled with laughing families only minutes earlier now held the bodies of victims who appeared almost untouched by fire, having succumbed instead to smoke and the crushing weight of the crowd around them. Rescue workers moved through the auditorium in near silence, carrying victim after victim out into the freezing December air, laying them along the sidewalks of Randolph Street when no other space could be found. Nearby buildings, stores, and offices were opened up and pressed into service as makeshift morgues, their floors lined with rows of the dead as the city scrambled to find enough space to hold them all. Word of the disaster spread through Chicago within hours, and by nightfall, crowds of anxious parents, spouses, and relatives had gathered outside the theater and the surrounding buildings, desperate for any information about loved ones who had gone to the matinee that afternoon and never returned. Some were reunited with survivors amid tearful, relieved embraces. Many others were not so fortunate, forced instead to walk somberly past row after row of the deceased, searching for a familiar face among the victims laid out for identification. Newspapers across the country ran the story within a day, and the death toll climbed steadily over the following days, as more victims succumbed to their injuries. When the final count was tallied, 602 people had lost their lives, a number that made the Iroquois Theater Fire the deadliest single-building disaster in the history of the United States up to that point, and for nearly a century afterward. As the city approached what should have been a joyful transition into the new year, the mood in Chicago instead turned somber and grief-stricken. Planned New Year's Eve celebrations across the city were canceled or quietly abandoned. Funeral processions filled the streets for days afterward, long lines of carriages and mourners moving slowly past storefronts, still decorated for the holiday season. A jarring collision between festive decoration and profound loss. Churches across denominations opened their doors for services dedicated specifically to the victims, and collection efforts sprang up throughout the city to support grieving families left suddenly without a parent, a child, or an entire household. In the span of a single afternoon, Chicago had gone from a city celebrating its own modern triumphs, its skyline, wealth, and grand new theater, to a city forced to confront an almost unbearable question. How had a building promoted so confidently as safe, as fireproof, as beyond the reach of the very disaster it had just suffered, failed so completely and so quickly? That question would not stay confined to grief for long. Within days, it would ignite a public reckoning that reached all the way to the highest levels of the city's government. Chapter 10: Blame, Corruption, and Empty Verdicts. In the days following the fire, grief in Chicago quickly began to curdle into anger. As newspapers dug into the story behind the disaster, it became clear that almost every failure that had contributed to the deaths of 602 people had been foreseeable and already known to the very officials responsible for preventing it. The public wanted answers, and more than that, the public wanted someone held accountable. Investigators soon discovered that the city's own building department had been aware of serious safety violations at the Iroquois Theater, well before the fire ever broke out. Just weeks earlier, in November of 1903, Mayor Carter Harrison had ordered a citywide safety review of Chicago's theaters, a response to growing concern about fire risks in the city's rapidly expanding entertainment district. That review reportedly turned up numerous violations at the Iroquois specifically, including issues related to its exits, its fire escapes, and its unfinished safety systems. And yet, city officials took no meaningful action to force the theater to close or make the necessary repairs before reopening to the public. The violations were documented, then they were ignored. In the aftermath of the disaster, Mayor Harrison himself was arrested and briefly held, accused of failing to enforce the very safety codes his own administration had been responsible for overseeing. He was soon released after a legal challenge, and ultimately, he was cleared of any personal criminal liability for the disaster. The city's building commissioner, the official most directly responsible for inspecting and approving theaters for public use, faced similar scrutiny, accused of allowing the Iroquois to open and continue operating despite known deficiencies that directly contradicted the fireproof reputation being sold to the public. Testimony throughout the investigation painted a picture of a city government that either could not, or simply chose not to, hold powerful theater owners and builders accountable for the safety of the very audiences filling their seats night after night. As the investigation expanded, blame spread outward in every direction. The theater's owners argued that they had followed the codes and standards required of them at the time, even as evidence mounted that basic safety features, exit signage, fire alarms, completed fire escapes, had simply never been installed. The architect, Benjamin Marshall, faced criticism for the unfinished state of several critical safety systems, though he maintained that decisions about cutting costs and rushing construction had ultimately rested with the syndicate financing the project, not with him. Electricians responsible for the arc lighting system that sparked the fire faced questions about the excessive electrical load reportedly being run through equipment not designed to handle it. Stagehands were questioned about the fire suppression tools that had failed to stop the flames in those critical first moments. Everyone had a role to play in the disaster, and yet almost no one appeared willing to accept meaningful responsibility for it. Multiple individuals were eventually indicted in connection with the fire, including theater owners, city officials, and members of the building's management. Grand juries convened, Trials were scheduled, and yet, case after case ended not in convictions, but in dismissals, delays, and simple abandonment of the charges altogether. Legal technicalities, shifting jurisdictions, and repeated postponements ground the judicial process to a halt. By the time the dust had fully settled, not a single person, theater owner, city inspector, architect, and the mayor had been convicted of any crime directly related to the deaths of 602 people. For a grieving city that had demanded accountability, the outcome felt like a second betrayal layered on top of the first. The fire itself had exposed how easily safety could be sacrificed in the pursuit of profit and speed. The legal aftermath exposed something almost as troubling: how difficult it could be, even after unimaginable loss, to hold anyone legally responsible for decisions that had cost so many lives. If justice could not be found in the courtroom, Chicago and the rest of the country would instead be forced to search for it somewhere else, in changing the very laws and standards that had allowed a disaster like the Iroquois to happen in the first place. Chapter 11. Ashes into Law. Though no one was ever held criminally responsible for the deaths of 602 people at the Iroquois Theater, the disaster did not pass without consequence. In the months and years that followed, the sheer scale of the tragedy forced cities across America to confront uncomfortable truths about the buildings where thousands of people gathered every single day. Truths that could no longer be ignored simply because they were inconvenient or costly to address. Chicago moved first. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, city officials ordered every theater within its limits closed for inspection, a sweeping and unprecedented action that revealed just how widespread the same dangerous shortcuts had become throughout the industry. Many of the very issues that had doomed the Iroquois were discovered in theater after theater across the city. Some venues were forced to remain closed for weeks while emergency repairs were made. Others never reopened at all. What had once been treated as minor, forgivable oversights were now being viewed, for the first time, as matters of life and death. From that reckoning came a wave of reform that would eventually reach far beyond Chicago's city limits. Building codes across the country began requiring exit doors to swing outward in the direction people would naturally be moving during a panic. Alongside this change came the widespread adoption of what became known as the panic bar, a simple horizontal bar mounted across the width of an exit door that could be released with a single forward push, even by someone who had never seen the mechanism before in their life. Illuminated exit signage became a standard requirement rather than an aesthetic afterthought left to the discretion of theater owners concerned about ruining the ambiance of a performance. Fire alarm systems directly connected to municipal fire departments became mandatory in theaters and other large public venues, ensuring that the delay Chicago experienced that afternoon could never happen again in quite the same way. Regular fire drills became an expected and enforced part of operating any large public venue. These changes did not remain confined to theaters alone. Schools, hotels, and other buildings where large crowds regularly gathered began adopting similar standards, recognizing that the same deadly combination, blocked exits, absent alarms, and overcrowded rooms, could just as easily turn any one of them into another Iroquois. Fire safety increasingly became a matter of public policy, enforced uniformly and taken seriously by municipal governments across the country. In the decades that followed, fire safety experts and historians would come to view the Iroquois Theater fire as one of the single most influential disasters in shaping the modern fire code, a tragedy so devastating in scale that it forced an entire country to change how it thought about public safety. The 602 lives lost that afternoon could never be given back. But in the years and decades that followed, the reforms born directly from their deaths would go on to save countless others, protecting audiences who would never know their names, but who would, quietly and unknowingly, walk out through doors that opened when they needed them to, because of a lesson written in fire, grief, and loss on a winter afternoon in Chicago. Chapter 12. Ghosts of Randolph Street. The building itself did not burn to the ground. Its steel frame, its stone walls, its marble finishes, the very features that had earned it the fireproof reputation in the first place, survived the disaster largely intact, standing empty and scarred on Randolph Street, while the city around it grappled with the aftermath. Within a few years, the interior was rebuilt and reopened under a new name, the Colonial Theater, an attempt to distance the venue from the memory of what had happened inside its walls. For a time, it operated much like any other Chicago theater, hosting performances for audiences who may or may not have known the full history of the ground they were standing on. But the name change could only do so much to erase what the building had witnessed, and by 1925, the structure was demolished entirely, torn down to make way for something new. In its place rose the Oriental Theater, an enormous and lavishly decorated movie palace that opened in 1926, designed in an elaborate style meant to transport audiences to an imagined version of the Far East, with ornate carvings, gilded columns, and an atmosphere of theatrical fantasy. Over the following decades, the Oriental Theater hosted some of the biggest names in American entertainment, comedians, musicians, and film stars, performing on a stage built directly above the same ground where the Iroquois disaster had unfolded decades earlier. The theater eventually closed its doors in 1981, sitting dark and unused for years before undergoing an extensive restoration. It reopened in 1998 under yet another name, the Ford Center for the Performing Arts, before being renamed once more in 2019 as the Nederlander Theater, honoring a family long associated with American Broadway productions. Today it continues to operate as a working Broadway-style theater in the heart of Chicago's Loop, hosting touring productions for audiences who walk through its doors, largely unaware of the ground beneath their feet. And yet, despite all these changes in name, ownership, and design, stories tied to the Iroquois disaster have never fully faded from the building or the block surrounding it. For decades, theater staff, performers, and visitors have quietly shared accounts of unexplained sounds echoing through empty hallways after hours, faint impressions of crowds where no crowds should be, and an unshakable feeling of unease in certain corners of the building that seems to defy easy explanation. Most persistent of all are the stories surrounding the narrow alley running alongside the building, the same alley where dozens of victims once fell to their deaths, a space that earned the grim nickname Death's Alley in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, and one that some claim still carries an atmosphere unlike any other stretch of pavement in downtown Chicago. Whether or not any of these stories reflect something beyond simple imagination and the psychological weight of tragic history, they speak to something undeniably true. More than a century after the fire, the memory of what happened on that stage has never fully left Randolph Street. The building changed, its name changed, but the story etched into that ground has proven far harder to erase than any renovation or rebranding could ever manage. Chapter 13. What the Fire Left Behind. The story of the Iroquois Theater is a story about the distance between what we are promised and what we are actually given. The building's owners promised a fireproof palace, a theater beyond the reach of the very disaster that had haunted the industry for decades. What they delivered instead was a structure fireproof in name only, its true safety sacrificed quietly in the pursuit of a faster opening and a more profitable season. 602 people paid the price for that gap between promise and reality. It would be easy to remember this simply as a story of fire spreading through muslin curtains and rising toward an unfinished ventilation system. But the truth is that fire was only ever the final piece of a disaster built long before that afternoon. The Iroquois did not fail because fire is uncontrollable. It failed because the people responsible for controlling it had already decided, in ways both small and enormous, that safety could wait. And yet, from that failure came change that has quietly protected millions of lives in the decades since. Doors that swing outward, exit signs that glow above crowded rooms, alarms connected directly to those who can help, drills practiced until they become instinct. None of it undid the loss suffered that December afternoon, but all of it exists because of it. Today, audiences still fill a theater on that same stretch of Randolph Street, unaware of what once happened beneath their feet. In a building shaped by a tragedy most of them will never learn the name of. The Iroquois Theater burned for less than 20 minutes. Its warning, however, has lasted for more than a century,